It was the vastest, most brutal and most merciless front of the entire war. Millions of men clashed in wheat fields, frozen forests, and cities reduced to smoking ruins. There was no respite, no rules, and no compassion. From the first shot of Operation Barbarossa until the fall of Berlin, the Eastern Front became an open-air slaughterhouse where a soldier's life was consumed by shell fire, disease, and hunger. The fighting wasn't battles. It was carnage that stretched for weeks, with temperatures that seared the skin or froze it to bits. The enemy wasn't just in front. They were in the sky, in the trees, in every crater. For the German infantry, every day in the East was a fight not for victory, but to survive another minute. This wasn't a campaign. It was total war. It was hell. And everyone who lived through it left a part of their soul buried in the red earth of Russia. Infantry in collapse. In the summer of 1941, German infantrymen crossed the eastern border with a firm stride. They wore clean uniforms, carried neat backpacks, had combat rations, and marched convinced that the campaign would be swift. They had been told that the Soviets were inferior, that the Bolshevik regime was weak, and that a few months would be enough to reach Moscow. Infantrymen were the essential support of the Wehrmacht. After the armored vehicles, they were the ones who took the villages, cleared the forests, and secured the crossings. Many came from years of training, others from battles in France or the Balkans. They were well-armed, well-organized, and confident in their command. The first weeks of Barbarossa seemed to confirm that promise of superiority. Columns advanced up to 50 kilometers per day. Soviet villages fell with little or no fighting. German soldiers saw Red Army prisoners surrendering en masse, disorganized, ill-equipped. In their letters home, they described the front as a march eastward, broken only by the burning of abandoned villages and endless sown fields. There was morale, there was confidence, there was a structure. 4 years later, in 1945, that infantry no longer existed. What remained were remnants, broken units, hastily assembled groups, untrained replacement soldiers, old men reintegrated into the front, and young men without basic instruction. Instead of advancing, they retreated. Instead of marching, they fled. Instead of conquering, they resisted to their deaths in a makeshift trench. The front was no longer a line, it was collapse. The difference was evident in every detail. In 1941, German infantrymen had transportation, air support, regular rations, and abundant ammunition. In 1945, they walked barefoot, ate moldy bread or stolen Soviet cans, and fired only when it was worth saving bullets. Units rearmed in the field, reusing rifles from the dead, or collecting unexploded grenades. The cold was the same, but there were no more spare boots or dry blankets. For the infantry, the last battles of the Third Reich were experienced as a sentence without trial. In East Prussia, platoons were surrounded one by Soviet divisions 5 times their number. German detachments were ordered to resist to the last man. Many of them had no support, no communications, no possibility of retreat. Positions were held for hours or days until no one was left alive. In the villages east of the Oder, soldiers dug trenches among the frozen remains of dead civilians. Houses were improvised forts with earth bags in the windows and squads of just 5 or 6 men. The battles were brief, brutal, sometimes hand-to-hand. In the infantry, there was no longer any talk of divisions. They fought in sections, often without contact with each other. There was no rotation, no rest, no reinforcements. Meanwhile, the Red Army advanced with an organization the Germans could no longer match. Each Soviet division was supported by tanks, artillery, and supplies. The German infantry, on the other hand, retreated on foot without air support or vehicles. In some sectors, the same group fought for weeks without leaving the line. At one of the critical points in Silesia, a group of Heer soldiers spent 15 days holding out in an unnamed village, surrounded without supplies, exchanging fire and burying their comrades in pits of frozen earth. None survived. Morale in those final months was a mixture of fear and resignation. Many soldiers knew the war was lost. They no longer believed in propaganda, victory speeches, or orders from the high command. But they couldn't surrender either. The stories coming from the East, rapes, mutilations, summary executions, reminded them that being taken prisoner by the Red Army could be a sentence worse than death. The only option was to hold on, even if it was for a few more hours. In Berlin, the infantry was reduced to battalion fragments, soldiers separated from their units, teenagers drafted into the Volkssturm, and veterans of the war in the east. Officers distributed Panzerfausts to young men who had never fired a weapon. They barricaded themselves in administrative buildings, subway stations, and communication hubs. Every intersection was a firing position, every window a line of defense. Conditions were inhumane. Men slept in rubble, ate whatever they could find. Ammunition was counted piece by piece. The Luftwaffe no longer existed. Artillery barely responded. The Soviets bombarded relentlessly. When Soviet infantry crossed a street, they did so with flamethrowers, explosives, and armored support. The Germans responded with carabiner rifles, grenades, and the remnants of their MG machine guns. At the Reichstag, resistance was especially fierce. Infantry sections were divided into groups of 4 or 5 men per room. The fighting raged floor by floor, stairway by stairway. There was no respite. On one side, the Soviets, who wanted to seize the symbol of Nazism. On the other, exhausted, dirty soldiers, some wounded, whose only thought was resisting to the bitter end. They fought with bayonets, knives, and helmets. Some battles ended in silence. Both soldiers, one Soviet and one German, were dead a few meters away without anyone noticing. The contrast with 1941 was brutal. In the first days of the invasion of the Soviet Union, German soldiers took entire towns without firing a shot. Villages were evacuated by fleeing civilians. Enemy positions fell one after another. Morale was high, logistics efficient, organization impeccable. The soldiers marched in columns, orderly, with constant support. In 1945, the German infantry was a patchwork of wrecks. Each group fought on its own, without coordination, without a plan. The front lines no longer existed. There was resistance at every point, but without continuity. Sometimes one street was defended, but the next one wasn't. Officers gave orders without maps, without communications, without knowing who was alive or dead. In small towns, the final fighting was even more chaotic. In some cases, German infantrymen arrived in an abandoned village only to discover the next day that the front had already left them behind. In others, they fought against Soviet units for hours, only to be ordered to retreat without means. There were no vehicles, there were no horses. Walking was the only option. Some attempted to cross the Elbe, seeking to surrender to the Americans, but many were intercepted by Soviet patrols before arriving. Those who survived were sent to prisoner of war camps. Many never returned. For the German infantry, surrender was no guarantee of life. The few veterans who had fought since 1941 and were still alive in 1945 spoke among themselves of the difference. They remembered Smolensk, Kiev, Minsk. They remembered marches in the sunshine, orderly convoys, clean uniforms. Now they slept in flooded subway tunnels, urinated in rusty cans, and ate stolen bread. They no longer believed in any ending. They only knew that what they had experienced couldn't last much longer. The first clash, the opening battles of Barbarossa. On June 22, 1941, at 3:15 a.m., the first German shells crossed the border into the Soviet Union. Artillery began pounding Soviet positions along the entire front line, from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea. In total, more than 3 million German soldiers, accompanied by nearly 1 million Axis allies, launched Operation Barbarossa. For the Heer infantrymen, that dawn marked the beginning of a war unlike any before. They had been told that the Soviets were poorly organized, poorly armed, and politically unstable. But the sheer size of the territory, the depth of the defense, and the resilience of some Red Army units soon proved that wrong. In the first few days, the German offensive relied on the principle of blitzkrieg. The panzer divisions advanced rapidly, enveloping Soviet positions, and the infantry followed behind, securing villages, clearing forests, seizing bridges, and finishing off pockets of resistance. The units were complete, coordinated, and well supplied. Each company knew its role, each section returned fire. Soldiers were organized into platoons with MG-34 machine guns, rifle squads, observers, sappers, and even interpreters to deal with civilians. The German army operated with precision, but the reality at the front showed that Soviet resistance was not always weak. While many Red Army units collapsed upon receiving the initial blow, others fought to the bitter end. In some sectors, the Germans encountered well-constructed bunkers, dug-in units that fired to the last man, and heavy artillery that slowed the advance. The German infantry, which had expected to advance unopposed, soon had to fight house by house, trench by trench, sometimes in sown fields, sometimes in wooden villages converted into makeshift fortresses. Every meter began to count. On June 24th, near Grodno, a German company attempting to cross a forest was surprised by a Soviet battalion that had managed to conceal anti-tank positions and heavy machine guns. What was supposed to be a simple mopping-up operation turned into a 10-hour battle with casualties on both sides. The German infantry, accustomed to coordinating with the armoured advance, discovered that in wooded or swampy areas they had to advance alone, in many cases without air support or the mobility of panzers. The common soldier lived those first days with a mixture of adrenaline and confidence. He believed himself part of an invincible force. But they were also beginning to see the harshness of the new front. Marches of up to 40 kilometers a day under a relentless sun, battlefields littered with unburied corpses, hunger, a lack of drinking water, and burned-out villages. Some soldiers wrote in their diaries that the Soviets seemed savages, but others were beginning to notice that such brutality was not weakness but rather fierce resistance. One of the first major clashes was the Battle for Minsk. There, German units managed to encircle the Soviet Western Front and capture more than 300,000 soldiers. But for the infantry, this victory also entailed days of guarding endless columns of prisoners, walking among bodies, disabling isolated enemy positions, and above all, reorganizing logistical routes in a territory without paved roads, without signs, and without adequate infrastructure. Advancing was not easy. Every bridge had to be repaired, every river crossed with improvised means, and every town inspected for the risk of sabotage. The Red Army, although disorganized, learned quickly. By July, ambushes began to increase. Small groups of Soviet soldiers cut supply routes, attacked outposts, and then retreated into the forest. The German infantry had to adapt. What had initially been a war of clear positions became a war of nerves. Constant patrols, night surveillance, and fighting against enemies who appeared and disappeared among the trees. In the south, resistance was stronger than expected. In attempting to take Kyiv, German troops faced a fierce defense. The infantry divisions of Army Group South had to cross the Dnieper under constant fire, in operations that resulted in thousands of casualties. The fighting took place under the blazing sun in poorly dug trenches, with supplies increasingly far from the front. Horse-drawn wagons carried ammunition, mobile kitchens were overwhelmed, and the wounded waited for hours to be evacuated. In many cases, they were simply left behind. The German infantryman, who in June believed he was in a rapid campaign, was already beginning to feel the strain by August. Many soldiers didn't understand how the Red Army, defeated time and again, continued to resist. Propaganda said the enemy was collapsing, but experience in the field didn't confirm this. In destroyed villages, they continued to encounter snipers. In cornfields, they continued to be ambushed, and in the forests, they continued to hear isolated gunfire night after night. As the weeks passed, the front deepened. Supply lines lengthened. Infantry units began to split up to cover more ground. Casualties were replaced by less trained recruits. Boots wore out. Food arrived late or not at all. Officers began to notice that the speed of advance had slowed and that Soviet resistance, far from disappearing, was reorganizing. And despite everything, the order was to keep advancing. There was no retreat. There was no pause. Units received maps without details, overly ambitious objectives, and the instruction to maintain momentum. Any soldier who fell was replaced. A platoon that suffered casualties was reinforced with administrative personnel or drivers. Infantry was no longer just infantry, it was all that remained, all that could hold a rifle. Winter arrives when cold replaced advance. For the infantrymen of the Third Reich, the arrival of the Russian winter wasn't just a change of season. It was a silent sentence. Beginning in November 1941, when temperatures began to drop below -20 degrees Celsius, the war transformed into something else. The enemy was no longer just the Red Army. The cold became more lethal than bullets, and the men, who had crossed the border in transitional uniforms and without adequate equipment, began to die by the hundreds without a single shot being fired. In the early days, when the ground hardened and the roads froze, units still tried to advance. Vehicle wheels became locked, engines froze at night, machine guns stopped working due to accumulated ice. Rifles had to be warmed with bare hands before firing, and that meant exposing the fingers to the freezing air, where they began to necrose in less than a minute. Some soldiers tried to urinate on the metal pieces to melt the frost, but that only worked for a few seconds. Sleep became a threat. Many soldiers stayed still in the trench, covered by a blanket, and simply didn't wake up. The body shut down without warning. Officers would patrol the positions in the mornings and find frozen men with their eyes open, clutching their rifles, as if still waiting for an attack. Others woke up with stiff, gangrenous legs, impossible to save. The extreme cold didn't feel like cold, it felt like a creeping numbness. First the feet, then the hands, and then the mind. Food arrived frozen, cans couldn't be opened, bread was like stone, water had to be heated with a wood fire, but wood was scarce. Those who tried to melt snow with a candle or a makeshift can only managed a bit of dirty liquid. Dysentery, vomiting, and fever were common. There were no medicines, there were no doctors, sometimes there wasn't even morphine. The defensive positions froze along with the ground. The trenches couldn't be dug, only shallow holes could be dug or ruins used as shelter. Many buried themselves in rubble, lit fires inside barrels, burned doors, furniture, even books. In the open field, they huddled 5 or 6 deep inside small shelters covered with tarps and covered with earth, trying to conserve body heat. Inside, the air was unbreathable. They slept in shifts, wrapped in wet blankets, next to corpses that couldn't yet be buried. Winter also changed the way of fighting. There were no more major offensives. Everything was reduced to holding the position. The bullets didn't whistle. They hit dry, fast, and the bodies fell heavily into the snow. Sometimes nothing could be heard for hours. Only the crunch of boots on the ice. Soviet snipers hid in chimneys among branches in destroyed attics. They waited for days. One wrong movement, a poking head, a flash of metal, and the bullet would come without warning. The wounded died quickly. Blood froze in seconds. A leg shattered by a mine would turn black before help could arrive. Stretchers split in the cold. Uniforms, soaked with snow, turned into hard plates. There was no way to dry them. And if the soldier didn't get a replacement, he knew that in a few days his toes would fall off. Corpses piled up at the edges of positions. They couldn't be buried. They were piled up. They were used as parapets. Some were covered with branches. Others simply remained exposed, frozen in the positions in which they died. In the middle of the night, rats and wild dogs would come and eat them. Sometimes the same soldier standing guard would pass by a frozen body that had been his companion the week before. Letters from home arrived late or not at all. The news was vague. There was talk of heroic resistance, of a temporary winter. But the men at the front knew the situation was different. The Red Army, adapted to the climate, counterattacked with troops dressed in white coats, skis and gloves. They had felt boots, fur-lined hats, and above all, they didn't stop. Soviet soldiers fought at night, at dawn, in blizzards. They assaulted positions with knives, grenades, and flamethrowers. The Germans had nothing to respond with. Winter also devastated discipline. Men who in France had followed orders without question now wept in the trenches. Some refused to leave the dugout, others feigned illness. Officers took harsh measures, arrests, punishments, even summary executions for desertion. But they knew the will was broken. The war that had begun with orderly columns of well-equipped soldiers had turned into a savage, hand-to-hand struggle for every bit of heat, every cigarette, every mouthful of hot soup. Stalingrad, hell on earth. On August 23, 1942, German artillery opened the Battle of Stalingrad with an uninterrupted roar that flattened entire neighborhoods and sowed embers over a still-living city. For hours, incendiary bombs turned the Volga quays into a blaze of oil, coal, and bodies burning in the current. The next morning, as the 1st Infantry patrols of the 71st Division advanced through the rubble, soldiers stumbled over twisted rails and burning beams and cut their way with bayonets through charred civilians hanging from melted balconies. From that moment on, the battle ceased to be a campaign and became an inferno that ground down men and material with a slowness that seemed eternal. Every block was a different battle. In the streets of the Dzerzhinsky tractor factory, German infantry clashed with Maxim machine gun nests concealed behind piles of metal slag. The hot iron cut through uniforms like razor blades. Soldiers rolling to the ground burned their hands on still red-hot sheet metal. They advanced in pairs, covering themselves with scaffolding planks as improvised shields, but the 7.62mm rounds splintered the wood, and splintering splinters dug into their fingernails. Each time a platoon managed to penetrate a workshop, they had to clear oil-soaked floors, fight their way through overturned lathes, and monitor the beams above where Soviet snipers shifted positions, crawling like cats among the charred polyurethane. The Soviets, for their part, received men on the run, barges crossing the Volga at night with reinforcements from the 62nd Army. Sometimes the boats arrived covered by a smoke screen, other times they were spotted and pulverized by German artillery. Those who survived disembarked soaked, pulling crates of ammunition and 50mm mortars that barely lasted a day. They were sent without delay to the industrial districts. Many didn't have rifles. They hid behind perforated walls, hoping to pick one up from a recently fallen comrade. "One rifle, 2 soldiers," the commissars repeated, who in turn faced the German rearguard with Tokarev pistols on their belts and the relentless order to shoot anyone who retreated. The conflict soon spilled into the basements and onto the rooftops. The Germans called this form of warfare Rattenkrieg, rat warfare. At ground level, the buildings were empty shells. Life moved below, among broken foundations and sewer tunnels where soldiers slept on crushed glass and breathed cement dust. At the Barricadi factory, the columns had fractured, and each room was an island. Russians in one corner, Germans in the next, separated only by a partition wall. Bombs ruptured the steam pipes, and the air filled with a boiling fog that blinded both sides. Men groped for each other, identifying each other only by the timbre of their language before plunging their bayonets. On Mamayev Kurgan, the earth turned daily into bloody mud. At dawn, a German battalion took the summit. At dusk, a Soviet counterattack recaptured it. The slope was pockmarked with superimposed craters. Bodies froze overnight and were half buried when the midday sun softened the clay. Sappers dug shelters under mortar fire, found fresh bones and shoveled them away without pause. The High Command promised reinforcements that never arrived because the Luftwaffe no longer ruled the skies. Soviet Il-2s swept the approaches, their shrapnel-shattering Opel Blitz trucks loaded with black bread and rifle ammunition. With October, the cold weather arrived and the stench changed. The ruins retained a sweet, pungent odor, human flesh mixed with wet plaster. The rats grew so fat that it was difficult to distinguish them from cats. They dared to gnaw at the boots and gangrenous fingers of the wounded. At the aid stations, exhausted doctors amputated limbs with blunt saws without chloroform, while outside Stukas whizzed by, dropping 250-kilogram high-explosion bombs. Each explosion knocked out the kerosene lamps, and the surgeons remained in the dark, probing severed tendons by the light of a flashlight held by a shivering orderly. The nights were filled with infiltration patrols. German assault squads burst into half-ruined houses, throwing stick grenades and blindly emptying their MP-40 magazines, only to discover that the Soviets had punched a hole into the adjacent house and reappeared behind them. The only fixed point was the Volga. The Soviets clung to its western bank with anti-aircraft gun nests mounted on sand platforms, which, lacking aerial targets, fired horizontally at the German positions. Tracer trails crisscrossed the sky like the ribs of a glowing animal. The German artillery responded with 105mm howitzers, tearing out swathes of earth and scattering fragments of shattered barges across the icy water. Hunger entered the equation. German rations were reduced to 200 grams of bread or cans of horse meat confiscated from the Romanian Sixth Army. The Soviets survived on raw flour mixed with paper shavings and soups boiled with leather belts. Often the exchanges of fire would stop for a few minutes when a batch of biscuits reached the lines, and everyone, Russians and Germans, would pounce on them like animals without distinguishing between uniforms. The first cases of dysentery and typhus appeared on the German side. Paramedics sprayed chlorine into the improvised latrines, but the frost made it impossible to dig deep pits, and the excrement remained exposed, ready to infect the next shift. General Paulus ordered a concentration of efforts on the Krasny Oktyabr factory in mid-November, convinced that the industrial complex was the key to splitting the city in two. The offensive opened with sweeping fire from PaK-40s positioned in neighboring blocks. German cannons destroyed entire walls, and the infantry advanced behind clouds of dust that reduced visibility to a few meters. But when the Germans entered the workshops, they found corridors blocked by mounds of sheet metal forming stepped parapets. Soviet DP machine guns peered out from gaps between the steel plates and mowed down men who tried to cross. German sappers threw demolition explosives that raised waves of rust. After each detonation, new Soviet silhouettes appeared, covered in soot and ready to die on the very slabs they were defending. In the underground tunnels of that factory, the humidity turned the bricks into slippery mud. The Russians strung electric cables along flooded galleries and connected them to captured generators, electrifying the water until they died in a spasm. The Germans responded with Flammenwerfer 41 flamethrowers. They injected torrents of fire that clung to the walls and consumed the oxygen in the tunnels in seconds. The screams of the trapped became shrill, animal-like, before dying with a hiss as they consumed their last breath of air. Upon emerging, the scalded skin of the enemy stuck to the burning nitrates and sloughed off their bones like toasted bark. Winter closed in on both armies. Blizzards hid the artillery smoke, and men from opposing sides often stumbled over each other in ash-filled corridors. They fired at each other at point-blank range and continued advancing with no time to finish off the fallen. Flashlights ran out of batteries, clocks stopped. Time lost meaning. Only the metallic scent of blood and the constant thunder of the Katyushas, nicknamed Stalin's organs, marked the day. When the rockets hit, the overpressure emptied the Germans' lungs, burst eardrums and ruptured eyes. Sometimes men survived, blind and deaf, until they were led staggering to a dugout where they were bandaged and ordered to return immediately to the line. High command orders called for the capture of the central railway station, a jumble of ruins that changed hands up to 15 times in a single day. There, wrecked railcars served as a barricade. Each overturned locomotive served as a natural bunker containing shrapnel. The Russians fired from the roofs of open-sided wagons. The Germans crawled beneath the iron studs, using their helmets as shovels to remove rubble and open observation holes. Lacking gasoline, the German armored vehicles advanced only a few meters before becoming immobile, transformed into combat towers. The Soviets surrounded them at night, glued anti-tank grenades to their armor and detonated them. By morning, the remains of charred steel and blackened visors remained, still smelling of gunpowder and charred flesh. In December, as the Volga River began to freeze, hunger and cold surpassed all previous calculations. Men decorated for actions in France cut pieces of leather from their boots and boiled them with coal slag to produce a thick, rancid-tasting soup. Russians tore tar paper panels from their roofs and burned them for warmth, inhaling a toxic mixture that made them dizzy and irritated their eyes. At forward command posts, radios no longer worked. Antennas were blasted by artillery or simply froze and snapped. Captains wrote messages on grease-stained paper and sent them in the hand of a liaison who often never arrived. The isolation became tangible. Units fought for days without knowing what was happening 2 blocks away. On November 19th, Operation Uranus sealed the encirclement of the 6th Army. Soviet armored divisions crossed the snowy plains to the north and south, enveloping the Romanians and closing the grip on Kalak-on-Don. For the German infantrymen trapped in the city, the change was immediate. The 88mm guns that had supported them until then stopped thundering. Their own artillery fell silent. The food barges never crossed the river again. The men began to weigh 40 or 50 kilos. Their coats became layers of blackened grease, their helmets bowls in which they melted snow to drink. Ammunition was metered out to the point of firing only when the enemy was so close that the flash scorched the wall. Some patrols ate raw horse meat, others retreated to sunken cellars to loot barrels of industrial oil and mix it with sawdust crumbs. They died of dysentery before being evacuated. On the Soviet side, the suffering was different but equally intense. The losses were enormous. Each brigade assembled untrained replacements. They were sent to the front with their names and a rifle whose chamber sometimes didn't lock. Faith in victory was accompanied by the certainty of sacrifice. Every meter cost dozens of men. Political commissars patrolled the trenches encouragingly, but the fear of the NKVD patrols, who shot deserters, was as real as the threat of a German MG-42. Even so, they kept advancing, meter by meter. The order was clear: keep the enemy clinging to the rubble until they suffocated. In January 1943, the Germans attempted a final push toward the riverbank to reconnect their perimeter with supply planes dropping containers from 1,500 meters. The packages fell scattered, many into Soviet hands, others sinking into muddy snow and being lost. The German infantry emerged from their dugouts wrapped in blankets that replaced their standard-issue overcoats. Their lips were chapped, their fingers blackened by frostbite, their eyes glassy. After each charge, the survivors retreated, dragging comrades missing their feet or hands, maimed by mortar shells. No one cried. There were no tears left, only absolute exhaustion. The rats continued to proliferate. In the tunnels, they ate corpses without distinction of nationality. The soldiers hunted some and roasted them over electric wire fires. The meat smelled like garbage, but it was food. Water was rationed to a jug per person. Snow mixed with pulverized coins was melted, scratching their throats when swallowed. Husbands wrote letters that would never leave the city. Family photos were glued to their chests with grease so they wouldn't lose them. By the end of January, the shots had become more widespread. Only ruins remained, piles of rubble and twisted overhangs that creaked in the wind. The squares were covered in a new silence, punctuated by distant artillery explosions or the rattle of flying shrapnel. In the Gum, in the central square, a handful of Germans, out of ammunition, surrendered to a Soviet section, their faces covered in soot. They handed over the remains of their weapons like useless sticks. One of them held a wrapper containing 2 moldy biscuits. He offered it to his captors with a mixture of shame and supplication. There were no words, only the dull sound of boots on packed snow as they marched under guard toward the Volga. Mud, blood, and despair. After Stalingrad, the Eastern Front stagnated into hundreds of kilometers of hastily dug trenches amid fields of scorched wheat, ruined villages and hills littered with human remains. The German offensive was no longer possible. Retreat was also not an option. The Heer infantrymen were forced to defend each line as if it were the edge of a cliff, and they did it by digging, shovel in hand, in rain, in snow, under fire. Trench warfare in the east had none of the systematic order of the Great War. There were no fixed sectors or detailed maps. The lines changed every day. A hill would be won at dawn and lost before nightfall. A forest would become a German stronghold one week and a death trap the next. The trenches were filthy pits, 1/2 meter deep, hastily dug with rusty tools or with bayonets. No drainage, no roof, no rest. In spring, the mud swallowed up their boots. The men sank up to their ankles and spent days with their feet soaked. The first cases of trench foot appeared. The flesh began to turn black, the pain was unbearable, and eventually the toes fell off on their own. There were no first aid kits or doctors available. The paramedics improvised with reused bandages or removed the dead parts with a knife, sometimes without anesthesia, just a wooden bar to bite on. The rations were minimal. 1 loaf of bread for 6 men, onion soup diluted with rainwater, salted meat that smelled rotten, and if there was no food, it was stolen, from Russians, from civilians, from dead comrades, the same with blankets, coats, gloves. The camaraderie that had been key in 1941 was crumbling in every meter of mud and blood. The nights were worse. In the trenches, the cold was breathtaking. You couldn't sleep for more than half an hour at a time without the risk of freezing. Guard shifts were constant, and every movement outside the pit meant risking death. Russian snipers, hidden among branches or in hollow trees, shot at anything that moved. Sometimes they aimed not at the head, but at the stomach to make the wounded man scream. When someone came out to help him, they fired again. It was called bait shooting. The day began in silence. Then Soviet shells fell randomly, 1, 2, 20, and the sky filled with dust. The men pressed themselves against the trench walls, covering their heads with their helmets, hoping it wouldn't be the last impact. Sometimes a nearby explosion would deafen them, or sever a leg, or tear an arm completely off. If they were lucky, they died without realizing it. If not, they bled to death within minutes as mud seeped into their wounds. The Soviets attacked in waves. 3 lines of men running across the open field. The Germans fired with everything: rifles, MG-42 machine guns, grenades. The first Soviet lines fell, but 3 more lines followed, and then others, until finally someone reached the trench. Then the hand-to-hand combat began. There were no tactics, just knives, bayonets, shovels. They hit each other with their helmets, their rifle butts, their hands. The mud mixed with blood. The ground was littered with intestines, teeth, broken cartridge belts, and unexploded grenades. When the fighting was over, those left standing dragged the wounded and went back to digging, always digging. The positions were reinforced with planks from destroyed houses, with bags of frozen sand with the bodies of the dead. Some soldiers placed corpses as protection. They used them as walls, seats, and parapets. The smell was unbearable, but no one said anything. Death had ceased to be an event. It was part of the landscape. The Soviet commissars harangued their men through loudspeakers. They promised vodka, medals, and leave. The German officers shouted orders, but no one listened anymore. People obeyed out of instinct, out of fear, to avoid being shot from the rear. The idea of victory had vanished. All that remained was to hold out one more day, one more shift, one more attack. In some sectors, the German artillery was unresponsive. No ammunition, no cannons, no possibility of reinforcements. The soldiers knew they were alone, that if the enemy broke the line, they would die right there. Some wrote their names on pieces of paper and sewed them to their coats, not for official identification, but so that if anyone survived, they could warn home. Rainwater was collected in empty cans. It was mixed with ash, with mud, with rat urine, but it was still drunk. There was no choice. Dysentery killed more than bullets. The men defecated on themselves and kept fighting. Their clothes were a second skin of filth, dried blood, and grease. Their hands became covered with fungus. Lice hid in the folds of their necks. Their bodies became a rotten husk that barely breathed. Snipers on the Russian front. On the Eastern Front, the sniper war was a shadow within a shadow, a silent skirmish where a poorly timed heartbeat was enough to kill. Bruno Sutkus, a Wehrmacht sniper, kept his casualty book with a rigorous accounting that he never mistook for pride. Every dawn began the same. An endless crawl over frozen mud or soaked grass, his rifle wrapped in rags to conceal his reflexes, his muscles cramped, searching for a space between roots or crushed bricks. There he remained, motionless, breathing against his fogged-up visor as the sun traced its arc. The shot came once, maybe twice a day, almost always at an officer, a gunner, or the unfortunate soul who poked his head out from behind the trench. Then came the change of position, crawling another few meters, erasing the trail, merging once more with the surroundings. But Sutkus didn't hunt in a vacuum. Even more disciplined hunters moved on the other side. Vasily Zaitsev kept track of his victims as if counting days on a calendar. In the rubble of Stalingrad, he learned to detect a slight change in light in an empty window, the imperceptible crunch of a boot on gravel. He killed hundreds, trained dozens, and turned the city's ruins into his own shooting gallery. Against him, the Germans in turn sent experts like Major Koenig. That duel, more legend than document, kept two men staring at each other through a telescopic sight for days, until one let out a flash of metal and the other pulled the trigger. This wasn't a unique case. Ivan Sidorenko, a stony-faced Georgian, honed his aim until he scored nearly 500 confirmed hits and trained more than 200 students. All of them set out knowing that the first mistake would be the last. Further north, Lyudmila Pavlichenko, Mrs. Death, recorded 300 kills before a mortar hit took her from the front lines to parade her through Washington as a symbol of Soviet resistance. Semyon Namokonov, a Siberian hunter, counted each shot by carving a notch in the buttstock. When he found himself surrounded in a ravine, he spent his last cartridges in the midst of retreat and stayed alive only because the enemy assumed no one would survive inside. Facing these figures, the German shooters worked under instructions equally supported by numbers. Sutkus's notebook recorded 209 names, dates, and exact distances. He himself had learned to calibrate his carabiner rifle by loading cardboard boxes with red dots the size of a fingernail and adjusting the sight until he could group 5 bullets into a single hole at 100 meters. That, or die when his Soviet counterpart fired first. Thus, the daily routine was a succession of micro-decisions. Is the trembling of that branch a strange wind or the breath of a man? Does that dark spot move with the logic of the leaves or that of the uniform? The cold added a layer of torture. At 20 degrees below zero, breath-formed clouds that could betray one's position. Many covered their mouths with a frozen handkerchief and inhaled the filtered breath to hide it. The metal of the trigger burned like snow if gripped without gloves, but the glove thickened the finger and ruined the feeling. Some amputated the piece of fabric on their index finger to maintain tactile sensitivity. Others urinated on the bolt to loosen the frost and prayed not to get stuck. Psychologically, hunting was a distorting mirror. Everything around was reduced to two glass circles, the lens and the pupil. Inside, a silent scene. Outside, the pulse skipping in the wrist. When the shot landed, the other person's body fell like a puppet with its strings cut. The shooter didn't even hear the scream, if there was one, because the thunder of the shot itself stole the sound. He only saw the figure collapse and immediately afterward felt that chill similar to when he put his hand in ice water, the certainty of having robbed him of all his futures. Sometimes the memories returned at night, a face pinned in the crosshairs, the red stain that sprouted right in the middle. Insomnia was made of those slides that couldn't be filed away anywhere. Both sides developed techniques to suppress the invisible enemy. The Germans adorned mannequins with officers' caps and raised them on a pole to draw Soviet fire. The Russians inflated hats with straw, let them protrude over the parapet, and measured the direction of the projectile to triangulate the enemy's hideout. When they discovered the enemy sniper, they responded with Katyusha rockets or heavy mortars, hoping to uproot the tree or demolish the parapet where he was hiding. And if after a few minutes there was no movement, someone would crawl around to see if he was still breathing. Often all they found was a broken telescopic sight and a dark stain where his head had been. Logistics also offered no respite. A marksman needed select ammunition, rifle scopes without rifle lines, and well-calibrated rifles. However, the supply chain collapsed daily. Convoys crossed the steppe under bombardment, trucks got stuck in an endless quagmire called Rasputitsa, and packages were distributed by chance. More than once, Sutkus fired captured Yugoslav cartridges because the Germans no longer had their own stockpile. On the other side, Zaitsev used German weapons found among the rubble when his own were damaged by cement dust. Fame, when it came, didn't lighten the load. A successful sniper attracted the enemy like a beacon. Each kill added rubles to the reward the Soviets placed on their heads. The Germans published their names in bulletins to boost morale, an Iron Cross, a boost of self-esteem. But that was tantamount to describing the prey in a giant advertisement. Sutkus was called the Wolf of Fichtenhöhe in the propaganda papers. The Russians responded over loudspeakers that this wolf would end up hanging from his own rifle. This wasn't bravado. As soon as a famous sniper fell, the Soviet loudspeakers listed his service record to prove that even ghosts were made of flesh. Female participation added another dimension. Pavlichenko was not an isolated case. Thousands of women sat behind the stocks and decorated their visors with painted flowers. Her aim was reminiscent of the light touch of sewing, just the right pressure, taut thread, clean seam. There were entire battalions where the majority of shooters were women, whom propaganda portrayed as protective mothers of the homeland. But in the trenches, no one thought of metaphors, only of the bullet that pierces the eye at 300 meters. Over time, sniper warfare became bloodier and, at the same time, more routine. Most veteran shooters ended up with invisible after effects, fine tremors in their fingers, flinching at the slightest click, the need to sit against a wall to cover their backs. Some were never able to hunt or practice sport shooting again. The scope magnified memories before targets. Others ended up as instructors, teaching novices how to divide distance by 6 and control their breathing. They repeated the method like a multiplication table, but at night they would wake up soaked, seeing the silhouette that fell in their scope. Those who didn't die from their own bullets ended up suffocated by artillery, by gangrene, or by the silence left by peace. Many, upon returning home, discovered they no longer saw the world on a real scale. Everything was mentally framed by a circle of glass. The street, the field, a child's face, everything was a potential target. They tried to talk about it and found no words. The sniper's profession was, by nature, a pact with silence. The roar of steel inside the tank battles. When tanks entered combat on the Eastern Front, the air became a dense mixture of smoke, screams, fire, and crushed metal. The roar of Maybach engines roared as if each vehicle were a steel monster spewing fire and death. But inside, life was claustrophobic, dirty, deafening. There was no glory, only a routine of shouted commands, oil-soaked levers, shells falling like hammers, and the constant fear of an enemy flare pinpointing their position. The Totenkopf men, inside their Tigers, knew that every battle could be their last, The thick armor of their tank was no guarantee of anything. They knew the Soviets hid anti-tank guns in barns among ruins under the snow. An ambush could spring from the ridge of a low hill or from the side of a forest. A single well-aimed salvo could pierce even the most heavily protected side if it hit at close range. Before the engagement, the tank commander reviewed his ammunition: armor-piercing, explosive, and incendiary grenades. Each type had its target: armored vehicles, infantry, fortifications. The loaders knew it by heart. By the time the first impact rang out, the gunner would already be looking through the sight, searching for the distant silhouette of the enemy. The clashes often began without warning. A jolt, a squeal of caterpillar tracks, a radio crackling a warning that arrived seconds too late. Soviet tanks like the T-34 and IS-2 were not museum pieces. They were fast, lethal, and numerous. When the Germans spotted a formation of Russian armored vehicles advancing through the dust or snow, they knew they couldn't stop them with a simple line of fire. They had to maneuver, use the flanks, wait for the perfect shot. Sometimes they got it. Sometimes they didn't. Witnesses described the interior of the tank as a rolling grave. The heat was unbearable. The air was thick with gunfire smoke and the perspiration of 5 men locked in a steel box. Each jolt of firing rattled teeth. The shell exited with a roar that made the ears bleed, and seconds later the echo of the impact. If it hit correctly, the enemy tank exploded from within, projecting its turret like a cork. If it missed, the response was not long in coming. A close-range impact ricocheted off the armor like a giant's fist. The commander shouted orders. The gunner adjusted his sights. The loader sweated, chambered another shell, and closed the chamber again. All in seconds. There was no time to pray, only to survive the next shot. When the enemy tank was hit, the Germans didn't celebrate. They knew that for every T-34 destroyed, there were 10 more, and that it only took one to slip through the lines to wipe out half a company. In battles like those at Kursk, the countryside became a burning graveyard. Tanks burned, men emerged engulfed in flames, bodies trapped between hatches. Grenades rained down into open compartments. Black smoke filled the sky. Sometimes they had to evacuate in seconds, jumping from the top of the moving chassis, running under machine gun fire, watching their own tank engulfed by fire. Mud was another enemy. Tracks buried themselves in the mud. Some tanks were stuck like beached whales, unable to move, waiting to be finished off by a shell. Others skidded on the icy slopes, swerving like wounded beasts until a Soviet shell split them in two. Inside the tank, there was no thought of strategy, politics, or ideals, only resistance, shooting first, keeping one's head down, making sure the next bullet didn't enter through the hatch. The loaders' hands were blistered, their eyes red from the gunpowder dust, their eardrums perforated by the constant hum of the engine. And yet they kept going, because if they abandoned the tank, they were dead, and if they stayed put, they were dead too. The radio crackled incessantly, reports of losses, of positions, of retreats. The commander had to decide in seconds whether to attack or retreat, whether to flank or sacrifice a tank to cover the others. The soldiers knew they weren't just pieces, they were moving targets. What didn't burn from enemy fire exploded from overheating or ran out of fuel. Every battle was a dance of steel, smoke, and death. Sometimes the German tanks advanced like an unstoppable line, smashing Soviet positions and sweeping through trenches. Other times they were caught between two fires, surrounded by enemy infantry with incendiary bottles, magnetic mines, and rockets. The roar of the engines became the mournful chant of the trapped crew member. And amidst that madness, the soldiers inside the tank knew that no one would see them die, that if they were hit, their bodies would be charred in the gunner's seat or trapped between the tracks. There would be no burial, no medal, just a report, another number on the list, and another tank to replace theirs in the next assault, because tank warfare had no heroes, only survivors, or remnants. With each advance, the fields were littered with charred turrets, ripped off tracks, and turrets split open like tin cans. With each retreat, the crews had to destroy their own tank if it got stuck, lest it fall into Soviet hands. And then, with a blowtorch or an explosive charge, they said goodbye to the only thing that had protected them from the outside world. Such was tank warfare on the Eastern Front, a rolling hell, a battle without respite, without distance, without respite. A moving trench where steel offered no shelter but merely a few more seconds of life. Each battle was the repetition of the same ritual: aim, fire, resist, fall. The final roar came not from the engine but from the silence that remained after the last explosion. Because where armor couldn't reach, death entered without asking permission, and no one escaped its wake unscathed. The last steps of the infantry. The last months of the German infantry in the East began with a routine that no longer resembled the War of Movement of 1941. By the end of January 1945, many battalions were barely half their official strength. The daily reports showed ammunition figures that weren't enough for even a day of sustained fire. Companies moved from town to town, more concerned with escaping the Soviet advance than maintaining a coherent line. Each night march meant abandoning damaged vehicles, dead horses, and artillery pieces that no one could tow. When new orders arrived from the army, the priority was almost always the same: plug a gap, delay a river crossing, or hold a village for 24 hours to allow the rest of the division to fall back. The weather was against them. The February snowfall combined with gusts of wind made prolonged use of the MG-42 machine guns impossible. Ammunition belts froze, bolts jammed, and the muzzle flash from the exposed barrel served as a reference for Soviet riflemen equipped with SVT-40 semi-automatic rifles. The infantrymen, wearing pressed cardboard boots with worn inner linings, improvised insoles of paper and straw to prevent frostbite. Many lost feeling in their feet, but they still had to dig new positions every night. The standing order was to keep their silhouettes low, not reveal the location of their trenches and ration stick grenades, because resupply no longer arrived by truck, but by carts pulled by 10 or 12 men. Contact with the civilian population changed daily. In East Prussia, the infantry suddenly found themselves flanked by columns of refugees fleeing toward the Vistula. There was a bitter joke among the soldiers that they were competing for the same stretch of road. Company officers would divert these convoys using warning shots to clear the way for the few motorcycles still functioning as liaisons. However, when the Soviet artillery approached, there was no choice. Infantry and civilians piled up in shared basements, tightly packed, unable to distinguish between uniforms and peasant clothes as they shivered at the whistling of the Katyushas. Direct confrontations increasingly consisted of brief clashes. A Soviet platoon would deploy with automatic rifles and anti-tank rocket launchers, advance to within 100 meters, and fire 2 or 3 rocket shots to open a gap. The German infantry responded with rifle fire and the occasional machine gun, but lacked sufficient anti-tank grenades. When a T-34 tank appeared on the main road, the battle was over in a matter of minutes. The company commander usually ordered a withdrawal before being surrounded. This hop-by-hop withdrawal mechanism eventually reduced the groups to platoons of 10 or 12 men who regrouped in the next village, where another officer reorganized them under a new company number. Medical casualties were not only due to wounds. Dysentery and typhoid fever spread through the ranks due to a lack of drinking water. Paramedics improvised bandages washed with melted snow and used industrial salt as an antiseptic. Morphine addicts abounded, soldiers with ampoules of synthetic opium to endure the march, until the supply ran out and withdrawal crises began right on the front line. Written accounts mention men tied to sleds to prevent them from self-mutilating in a delirium. By mid-March, rumors of imminent capitulation mingled with slogans of absolute resistance. Some officers distributed leaflets that spoke of negotiations with the Westerners. Others repeated Wehrmacht radio dispatches that still promised a counterattack on the Oder. This dissonance shattered the infantry's last tool, discipline. Some groups, having lost contact with superior regiments, buried their automatic weapons and dispersed in civilian clothes taken from abandoned farmhouses. Others formed small rearguard detachments to cover the escape of their own army corps, remaining in position until their ammunition was exhausted and then attempting to break through the Soviet lines at night. The moment of surrender was almost always chaotic. A battalion could receive a ceasefire order at dawn and, at the same time, suffer a preliminary bombardment by Soviet artillery that had not yet been reported. In most cases, the surrender was negotiated at the company level. The German officer handed over his pistol, formed the men, and awaited instructions. The Soviets disarmed the prisoners, requisitioned watches, knives, serviceable boots, and backpacks. The columns set off eastward almost immediately. The transfer to captivity became a physically demanding experience comparable to any battle. They walked between 20 and 30 kilometers a day. There was no regular food. The ration consisted of a shared bucket of watery porridge at dawn and clear soup at dusk. Anyone who fell was spurred on with a rifle butt. If they didn't get back on their feet, they were left behind. In the forests of Belarus, it was still snowing, and soldiers began using pages from their field notebooks as bandages against the cold. Many, exhausted, drank water from contaminated puddles and developed infections that, combined with fatigue, killed them before reaching any camp. At railway checkpoints, prisoners were counted and redistributed into cattle cars. Those who still had a jacket or coat used it to cover the makeshift latrine in a corner, clinging to the last vestige of modesty. Silence reigned, broken occasionally by a violent cough or the cry of a conscript too young to withstand the pressure. The smell of urine and sweat permeated the wood. The convoy stopped only to remove corpses. During these pauses, the living were allowed to fill a bucket of murky water from a nearby well. Upon reaching the filtration camps, the classification was summary: junior officers, non-commissioned officers, enlisted men. Photographs were taken of each prisoner, minimal information was recorded, and a number was assigned to replace their name. Personal clothing was sprinkled with disinfectant powder and sometimes incinerated. Used Soviet clothing, several sizes too large, was issued. The prisoners' heads were shaved to prevent lice. Many had their beards shaved off along with their dry skin, causing infections that barely received a rough gauze bandage. The first weeks in the camp revealed the extent of the distress. There weren't enough barracks for everyone. The still frozen ground necessitated digging trenches where barbed wire fences were haphazardly strung. The prisoners slept sitting up back to back, taking turns resting. Breakfast consisted of 200 grams of black bread and barley infusion. When they were lucky, a piece of turnip was added to the evening soup. The official discourse promised repatriation after the signing of some international agreement. The reality was that many of the new arrivals would not live to see the following winter. Daily labor included road construction and forest clearance. The work schedule was relentless, 100 logs per crew before nightfall. Without proper tools, they used blunt axes and unoiled saws. Gloves were a luxury. Hands soon became covered in deep cracks that festered with splinters and dirt. Musicians identified among the troops were assigned to play accordions or makeshift flutes during short breaks to keep up morale. Some refused and were punished by standing all night. Others played silently while the column chewed rationed bread with trembling hands. The winter of 1945-46 was the first in captivity. Respiratory diseases carried dozens each month. Firewood was scarce and the barracks were heated with tin stoves fueled by wet roots. The heat barely lasted an hour. To stay alive, the prisoners recycled the same blankets over and over again, sewing patches with shreds from potato sacks. Internal barter networks formed, pieces of soap for a usable buckle, a dry cigarette for half a ration of thick soup. The improvised hierarchy reproduced the military structure in miniature. Former officers organized cleaning and assigned latrine shifts. Non-commissioned officers kept count of the sick and dead. The arrival of spring brought no relief. The thaw turned the camp into a quagmire. The typhus parasite thrived, and the Soviets responded with mass quarantines. Hundreds of prisoners were held for days in open-air barbed wire fences, doused with quicklime and drenched by the rain. Survivors described scorched skin and the sensation of the dermis peeling away like bark. The casualties were buried in mass graves marked only by a numerical stake. The act of placing a first name on a tablet was punished as ideological sabotage. Over time, the routine of captivity became as mechanical as the war itself. There were morning roll calls, work marches, and nightly inspections. The prisoners learned basic Russian to negotiate with the guards. Jleb for bread, voda for water, bolit for pain. Unexpected bonds were also formed. Some Soviets sent pieces of bread hidden in an empty kerosene can, risking sanctions. In return, German prisoners were taught how to read Roman numerals or repair pocket watches. In 1947, the first repatriation groups were announced. It wasn't a matter of military merit, but of health. Those who couldn't lift a shovel were considered unfit for forced labor and therefore candidates for return to Germany. The return journey was as painful as the outward journey, although with less direct violence. Some got off the train at the border barefoot, wrapped in Soviet blankets, not knowing if they would find any family. Others, terminally ill, died a few miles from their homeland. For those who remained, hope was reduced to surviving another winter. They knew that each thaw would take a dozen more. They recorded the names of the dead on makeshift tablets, certain that these records might never reach any Red Cross office. When writing, no one used heroic phrases. They spoke of cold, hunger, diarrhea, silence. It was the only way to tell the truth without embellishment and without conclusions, because the story for them remained open. It depended on whether the next truck would bring potatoes or just icy wind.